Welcome. We start with South Africa. President Cyril Ramaphosa has warned world leaders that trade is being used as a weapon, as he confirmed his country is in talks with the United States to reduce tariffs. At the United Nations General Assembly, Ramaphosa called for trade to be fairly regulated. He warned that unilateral trade practices and economic coercion are damaging many nations.
It is concerning that geopolitical shocks and unprecedented trade policy volatility are destabilizing the global economy and jeopardizing a critical source of development finance. In fact, trade is now being used as a weapon against a number of countries in the world. We must redouble our efforts to strengthen the link between trade and development. Unilateral trade practices and economic cohesion have a detrimental impact on many nations.
South Africa has delivered a blunt message to Washington, warning that turning trade into a political weapon could have serious and unintended consequences. The warning comes amid rising global tension, as nations across the world watch carefully how the United States uses tariffs, sanctions, and trade pressure to achieve strategic goals. President Cyril Ramaphosa's remarks underscore a growing unease among emerging economies and U.S. allies alike. Trade, once a tool of mutual prosperity, is increasingly being wielded as a geopolitical hammer, and the blowback could be significant. Speaking from Pretoria, President Ramaphosa emphasized that South Africa is not opposed to trade discipline or accountability. However, he highlighted the danger of weaponizing commerce, a practice that risks destabilizing not only the United States' relationships abroad, but also global markets. When trade becomes a tool of political coercion, it does not just affect the targeted nations. It undermines the stability of the global economic system. He warned, noting that such tactics threaten investment, supply chains, and long-term economic planning for countries that depend on international trade for growth. The concern is far from abstract. The trade strategies initiated during the Trump era, characterized by aggressive tariffs, unilateral pressure campaigns, and a focus on bilateral deal-making over multilateral cooperation, have left a lasting imprint on global trade dynamics. These policies, originally designed to protect domestic industries and pressure trading partners, created ripple effects that continue to shape the decisions of governments around the world. Countries are now increasingly cautious, seeking to diversify their trading partners and safeguard against the risk of sudden punitive measures. South Africa finds itself particularly sensitive to these pressures. As a resource-rich nation and a key player in Africa, it depends heavily on exports for economic stability. Minerals, metals, agricultural products, and manufactured goods form the backbone of its trade, making it vulnerable to abrupt changes in tariffs or trade barriers. For nations like South Africa, stability and predictability in trade are not abstract ideals. They are economic necessities that affect jobs, investment, and long-term growth. President Ramaphosa's statement comes at a time when South Africa is actively seeking fair and balanced trade agreements that protect its interests without falling victim to political leverage. The country's approach is clear. It will engage with global partners, including the United States, but it will push for rules-based frameworks that do not exploit trade as a tool of coercion. This stance reflects a broader trend among emerging economies, many of which are re-evaluating their reliance on traditional economic partners and exploring alternative alliances to safeguard their growth prospects. The implications of South Africa's warning extend far beyond the African continent. Emerging economies across Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East are increasingly attentive to how the United States leverages its economic dominance. Washington's historic ability to impose trade sanctions or extract concessions through tariffs has made other nations wary of over-reliance on American markets. In some cases, this has accelerated moves toward regional partnerships, diversification of export destinations, and closer ties with alternative economic powers, notably China and the BRICS bloc. For the United States, the risks are not only economic, they are diplomatic. Aggressive trade tactics, while sometimes effective in the short term, can strain long-standing alliances and generate resentment among nations that once viewed Washington as a reliable partner. Retaliatory measures, including counter-tariffs, stricter investment regulations, and preferential trade arrangements with competing powers, are increasingly part of the global response to perceived coercion. In this sense, the weaponization of trade is a double-edged sword. It may achieve immediate political objectives, but it can also create long-term vulnerabilities and weaken strategic influence. The strategic calculus behind South Africa's caution is clear. The country occupies a pivotal position in the African economy and plays a leading role in regional organizations that influence continental trade policies. Its stance signals to other nations that trade disputes are not simply bilateral matters. They are part of a broader conversation about global economic stability, fairness, and predictability. By speaking out, South Africa is asserting that nations will not passively accept arrangements that prioritize political leverage over mutual prosperity. President Ramaphosa's warning also highlights the interconnected nature of today's global economy. In a world where supply chains stretch across continents and commodities markets are tightly linked, disruptions in one region can ripple through the entire system. Tariffs or trade restrictions imposed by the United States do not only affect American importers or exporters, they impact producers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, financial markets in Europe, and energy flows worldwide. South Africa's message underscores the need for a more measured approach, one that balances national interests with global stability. The echoes of Trump-era trade policies remain powerful. Bilateral negotiations that prioritize short-term leverage over multilateral rules have left countries wary and searching for alternatives. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, policymakers are actively exploring ways to insulate their economies from sudden trade shocks. Some are investing in regional trade infrastructure. Others are deepening relations with emerging economic powers, while others are pursuing diversified export portfolios to reduce dependency on any single partner. South Africa's call for fair trade agreements fits squarely within this larger global movement. Yet, the United States remains a central actor, wielding extraordinary economic influence. Its markets, financial systems, and technological capacity continue to be key levers in the global economy. For Washington, this influence comes with responsibility. The choices it makes in applying trade pressure, negotiating tariffs, or shaping bilateral agreements will resonate far beyond its borders. Missteps risk alienating allies, emboldening competitors, and triggering a cascade of strategic realignments that could weaken American economic and diplomatic standing. The potential blowback is already visible. Retaliatory trade measures are being considered by countries that feel vulnerable to coercion. In some cases, this includes tariffs on U.S. goods, restrictions on American investment, or preferential trade arrangements with alternative partners. These moves do not occur in isolation. They are part of a broader strategic calculation aimed at ensuring economic resilience and reducing exposure to unilateral pressure. South Africa's stance signals to other nations that the era of unquestioned American economic dominance may be evolving into a more contested, multipolar landscape. Global investors and multinational corporations are also watching closely. Uncertainty in trade policies can affect investment decisions, disrupt supply chains, and alter risk calculations. Companies that rely on stable, predictable trade conditions may reconsider their global footprint, shifting operations or sourcing strategies to avoid exposure to potential economic shocks. For nations like South Africa, the stakes are high. Their ability to attract investment and maintain economic growth hinges on confidence that trade rules will be transparent, consistent, and fair. The broader geopolitical context cannot be ignored. Emerging economies, particularly in Africa and Asia, are increasingly engaging in strategic partnerships that provide alternatives to the traditional dominance of the United States. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS economic agenda, and regional trade agreements offer nations options that reduce dependency on American markets and provide leverage in negotiations. South Africa's warning reflects an acute awareness of these dynamics. Nations will not accept coercive trade practices when credible alternatives exist. President Ramaphosa's approach is cautious yet firm. He is not advocating confrontation for its own sake. Rather, he is urging a recalibration of strategy, emphasizing collaboration, fairness, and stability. By highlighting the dangers of weaponized trade, he is signaling that short-term gains achieved through coercion may ultimately erode long-term influence and credibility. His message is clear: economic leverage must be exercised responsibly, with an eye toward mutual benefit rather than unilateral advantage. For the United States president, the challenge is evident. Balancing domestic political imperatives with global economic realities requires a nuanced approach. Aggressive tactics may yield immediate headlines and perceived victories, but they risk creating fractures in alliances, prompting retaliatory measures, and driving nations toward alternative partners. The question now is whether Washington will adjust its approach to trade, shifting from coercion to cooperation, or continue on a path that could produce unintended economic and diplomatic consequences. The stakes extend beyond economics. Trade policy is now inseparable from broader strategic considerations, including security, diplomacy, and global influence. Countries are aware that economic coercion can translate into political leverage, but they are equally aware that overreach can backfire. South Africa's warning exemplifies this tension, a strong, measured voice that emphasizes the importance of fairness and predictability while signaling the risks inherent in turning trade into a weapon. As nations observe, calculate, and respond, the implications for global governance are profound. Multilateral institutions, regional trade blocs, and bilateral agreements are all being tested by the evolving approach to commerce. The pressure is on Washington to consider not only the immediate impact of tariffs or trade restrictions, but the long-term repercussions for its alliances, credibility, and strategic standing. The world is watching, and the response will shape not only the trajectory of South Africa's economic engagement, but the broader architecture of global trade for years to come. South Africa's warning is a reminder that in an interconnected world, economic actions have far-reaching consequences. The use of trade as a political weapon may achieve short-term leverage, but it can also destabilize markets, strain relationships, and encourage countries to seek alternative pathways. In a sense, the message is as much a cautionary note for global policymakers as it is a statement of national principle. Economic influence carries responsibility, and miscalculation can produce results far beyond immediate expectations. The broader lesson is clear. Emerging economies and established trading partners alike are increasingly asserting their agency, seeking trade arrangements that protect their interests while reducing exposure to unilateral pressure. In this environment, Washington's approach to trade must be recalibrated, balancing leverage with diplomacy, discipline with predictability, and short-term objectives with long-term stability. South Africa's warning is both a signal and a challenge. Will the United States heed the caution, or risk unintended economic and diplomatic consequences that could reverberate across continents? As the global economy continues to navigate these shifting dynamics, the coming months will be telling. South Africa's stance exemplifies a growing trend of nations demanding fairness, transparency, and respect for established rules. The international community is watching carefully, and the consequences of missteps could extend well beyond any single trade negotiation. In this high-stakes environment, the decisions of the United States president will not only shape domestic economic outcomes, but influence the trajectory of global trade, alliances, and geopolitical stability for years to come. The warning from South Africa is more than rhetoric. It is a strategic signal to Washington and a call to the international community. Trade must remain a tool for growth and cooperation, not coercion. Failure to heed this principle could trigger a chain reaction that undermines confidence, strains alliances, and pushes nations toward alternative partnerships. The question now is whether the United States will recalibrate its approach in recognition of these risks, or continue to wield trade as a weapon and face the possibility of unintended, far-reaching consequences that extend well beyond its borders.